How to add delays inside your Foreach and while loops with Blueprint in Unreal. Because even though I don't really recommend to add a bunch of delays all over the place in your project, I still think it's a pretty useful feature if you want to debug your code and you want to take the time to see what's happening in between the iterations of your loops. So let's get to it. And so in Unreal, here I have a pretty simple project, but it doesn't really matter since we're going to do everything from scratch. So the first thing we're going to do is here in the content browser, I'm going to create myself a macro libraries to contain all the different loops. So here right-click Blueprint and Blueprint macro library. I'm going to have to choose the parent of my macro library. Usually we will choose the object class, which is the parent of everything in Unreal, but we cannot do that in our case because we want to use a delay inside that macro library, and it's not possible to use a delay inside a macro library that is a child of object. It has to be a child of a class that supports a delay node. And in our case today, we're probably going to choose the actor and maybe also the user interface, because I think that with those two classes combined, it's going to cover most of your cases. But now we're going to start with the actor. So let's click on actor and then we can name it. So BML underscore delay underscore actor, because that one is a child of actor. So I'm just going to identify it that way. And then we can simply open the macro library. And here you can see that we don't have anything. We just have a default macro and it's named the new macro. That's not great. We're going to rename it. So I'm going to rename it for loop with break and delay, because we're going to create a for loop with break, but we're also going to add the delay in there. So for loop with break and delay, and then we have to code the macro. That's the graph that we have right here. And to do that, we're going to start by recreating a copy of the for loop with break. So I'm just going to search for loop with break, and we're going to use that one to recreate our function. So I'm just going to reconnect all my pins right here. So reconnect my execute, my first index, last index, break, same thing for the output. So loop body, index, and completed. Here we go. I recreated my for loop with break. Super simple up to now, but we don't want to do exactly that. We don't want to just recreate the for loop with break. That's not what we want. We want to modify the content of the for loop with break. So what we're going to have to do is take the code inside that macro and modify it to include the delay in there. So to do that, I'm just going to, let's say, right click on the for loop with break, and then I can simply choose expand node. That's going to expand all the code that is inside the for loop with break. But actually it expanded the node, but it didn't reconnect everything to the input and output. Yeah, that's not great. I could reconnect them myself, but I'm too lazy to do that. So instead, I'm just going to Ctrl-Z, Ctrl-Z, Ctrl-Z until I'm back in that position. Now I undid the expand, and instead of expanding this node right here, I'm going to do a little trick that's going to simplify our life a little bit. So what I'm going to do is double click on the for loop with break. That's going to open the standard macros that are inside the engine. Right here, it's really important to not modify any of that code. That code is inside the engine. It's inside the current version of the editor you're using. And if you modify that code, it's going to modify it for all your projects. Everything that is using this version of the engine is going to have your modification. And that's not what you want. You don't want to mess up with the default for loop. It's working. You don't want to break it by mistake. We don't want to modify this function. We're just going to copy everything from in there and paste it inside our new macro library. And to do that, what I'm going to do is select everything. And then with everything selected, I'm going to right click and do a collapse node. That's going to collapse everything into a little graph right here. And that graph will be able to expand it properly, and it's going to keep all the connected pins while doing so. But before we do that, I'm just going to take note of everything that is connected to my nodes to make sure that we're reconnecting everything properly. So the execute is in the empty pin, then the break is inside execute 2, first index is equal to value, last index is equal to B, and then for the output, how does it look? Okay, the then 0 is equal to the loop body, and then else and else2 are connected to completed. Okay, so we have to keep note of that to make sure that we redo the same exact connections in our macro library. Okay, good. So we took note of that. Now we're just going to copy paste this node inside our macro library. So copy this one. So I can just right click on it and do a copy, or Ctrl-C if I want to. And then before we go paste it in our graph, I'm just going to Ctrl-Z everything that I did inside the standard macros. Here we go. I'm back to what it was before. And that's exactly what we want. We don't want to modify the standard macros at all. We want to leave it as is. I just temporarily modified it to be able to copy the collapse node. But now I'm back to what it was before, and I'm not even going to save the standard macros ever, because I want to be 100% sure that I'm never going to modify that code. Perfect. So now I'm back to what it was before. I copied the graph in my clipboard, and now I can go paste it in my code. So I can go back in the BML delay actor right here, and I can just Ctrl-V to paste. Here we go. I have my node here. Now I can reconnect all my connection to the right location. So the empty one goes into the empty one, first index in value, last index in B, the break goes in execute 2, and then the else and else2 are going in completed, the then is going to loop body, and the variable is going to index. Here we go. Now I can delete this for loop with break because we don't need it anymore, because we have this one which does the same exact thing, and now we can expand this node and it should keep all the connected connections. So I'm just going to right click on the node and do expand the node, and this time we can see that it expanded the code. It's the same to what we have in the standard macros, and it's also connected to my input node and my outputs node right here. Perfect. Everything is the same as what we have inside the standard macros. If you want to double check, you can just go back in the standard macros, see how it looks, and then come back and compare, but we can see that they are both the same. So perfect, it worked properly. We now have our own for loop with break. Good, that's a start. Now we want to add a delay in there. So where do we want to add the delay inside the for loop with break? Well, I'd say it will be good to add the delay in between the iterations, because that's what we want. So this is the start of the iteration. So the then 0 calls the loop body. And once it's done calling the loop body, it checks if the for loop is completed or not. And then if it's not completed, it's going to increment the current index of the loop and then start with a new loop right here. So start with a new loop, execute the loop body, and then check if it's finished. If it's not, it's going to increment and continue that way until the end of the for loop. So what we're going to do is adding a delay between the true of the branch and the assign right here before incrementing the index of the loop. So here I'm just going to add a delay. So delay, there we go. I have my little delay. So it's going to execute the loop, wait a small delay, and then increment the index, start with a new loop, wait for a small delay, increment the index, start with a new loop until the for loop is completed. Good. So now we have a delay in the for loop. I can just connect the duration back to the beginning right here. So we can provide it as input, and I'm going to rename my variable on the right to delay. Here we go. I'm also going to reorganize my variables a little bit so it's placed right before the break, because I think it looks a little bit nicer. Here we go. We're done with the for loop with break and delay. That was relatively simple. Now we're going to do the same exact thing for the for each loop. So top right corner here, we're going to add a new macro. So add a macro. This time I'm going to name it for each loop with break and delay, because that's what we're going to do. Inside the graph, we're going to do the same exact thing we did in the previous function. So we're going to start by looking for the for each loop with break. Here we go. I have it right here. I'm going to reconnect my input and output to the inputs node and outputs node. So reconnect everything, loop body, array element, array index, completed. Here we go. My for each loop with break is recreated. Now we have to expand the code that is inside that node, and we're going to do the same exact thing we did for the previous function. So double click on the node. It's going to bring you in the standard macros. Once again, you don't want to modify anything in here. Be really careful. I'm just going to select everything. Right click on one of those and do a collapse node, and then that's going to generate a little graph right here that we're then going to be able to copy and paste in our code. But before that, I'm just going to take note of the connection. So here my exec is connected to the empty, and then the break is execute to, and then we have the array obviously. And then if we go on the right, take note of that. My else is connected to the completed, then 0 is connected to the loop body, and then array element and variable. Perfect. We took note of everything. Now I'm just going to copy this node, Control C, or I can right click and do a copy, and then I'm going to Control Z to revert everything we did inside the standard macro. There we go. I'm back to what I was before. I didn't change anything. This is just the normal standard macro, and we don't want to modify that. Perfect. Now I'm going to go back in my code right here, and I'm going to paste my new node right there, and I can just reconnect everything. So that one is here, the execute is the break, the array is connected in both. Here we go. And then the else is going to be the completed. Then we have the then 0, the loop body, and then we have the output, and the array is the variable. Perfect. I can delete that one. Okay. So here we have the little graph that we can expand. So I'm just going to right click on it and do an expand node. That's going to give me my graph, and everything is connected to the inputs and output. So I have my input all the way here, and I have my output all the way there. Here we go. That's a little bit small because that macro is pretty big. Here we go. We now recreated the for each loop with break. If you want to compare, you can always go back in the standard macros, look at the code to see if it's exactly the same, and it can come back. And yeah, it's pretty similar. So I think it worked. Perfect. Now it's time to inject the delay in there. Where are we going to inject the delay? Well, we're going to do the same exact thing that we did in the previous function. So we're going to add it right before incrementing the index of the for loop. So here in the then one, I'm just going to add a simple delay. So delay. Here we go, as simple as that. So we're executing the loop body. After that, we're going to wait a little delay, and then we're going to increment the loop counter and then start over. So check if we're done with the loop, executing the loop body, wait a little delay, and then increment. Good, that makes sense. Then I'm just going to connect my duration of my delay all the way back to the beginning. I have to zoom out a little bit. So duration all the way to the input. Here we go. I have my duration that I can rename delay right here, and I can reorganize my pin to place them right before the break. Perfect, we're done with that one too. The for each loop with break and delay is complete. Now we just have the last one, the while loop with break and delay. So I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna go in the top right corner, do a add a new macro. The macro is gonna be named the while loop with break and delay. And we're gonna do the same thing as the previous one. So we're going to add the while loop in there. We're gonna connect it to the inputs and outputs. Addition, loop body completed. Here we go. Then we're gonna go inside the while loop because we want to copy that little piece of code right here. We could copy it, it's pretty simple, but we can also do the same thing. So collapse node, copy paste the graph, Control Z, here we go. And we can come back in our macro library, paste it right here, and then we can just connect the condition just like that and connect the loop body and the completed. Here we go. We now have the collapsed graph that we can then expand. So right click, expand the node. Here we go. We now recreated the while loop. Perfect, super simple. Now we just need to inject the delay, and we're going to do the same exact thing as before. So right after executing the loop body in the then one here, we're just going to add the delay right here. Perfect, connect it to the beginning, and we can rename it the delay. Here we go. We're almost done with the while loop because now it's a while loop with delay, but it doesn't have a break because usually when you want to break out of a while loop, you just have to turn the condition to false and it's going to break out of the while loop, and that just makes sense. Like, it's just simple. But I also want to add the possibility to break out of the while loop without changing the condition. That way, even if the condition is still true, you're still going to be able to break out of the while loop because maybe that's something you want to do. So let's do that. To add that possibility though, there's nothing in here that does it for us, so we're just gonna have to code it ourselves. And actually I say that, but I'm not going to do it myself. Unreal already did it in their own function, and I'm just going to replicate the same exact logic because, well, I think they are smarter than me and I don't want to try to recreate what they did. So I'm gonna go back in one of my other loops. So let's say the for loop with break. In this for loop, how do they break out of the for loop? What's deciding if we want to break or not? It's this little local boolean right here. At the beginning of the for loop, we're setting it to false. So we say that this boolean is equal to false at the beginning of the for loop. And that boolean is the do we want to break boolean. If we want to break, we're just going to set it to true right here. So when we call break, it's going to set its value to true. So by default, it's set to false. And then when we want to break, it's going to be set to true. And then when the code checks if we're done with the for loop or not, it's going to check the status of that boolean. If we don't want to break, so if the boolean right here is equal to false, it means that we don't want to break, and then it's going to compare that with the current value of the for loop and say if we want to continue the loop or not. If that boolean becomes true right here, it means that we want to break, so the nut is going to invert it, so make it a false, and then the end is going to be false, obviously, and then it's going to complete our for loop by calling the completed pin right here. So if the boolean is false, it means that we don't want to break, so this is going to be true. If the boolean is true, it means that we want to break, so this is going to be false. So we're going to replicate the same exact logic in our code. So I'm just going to copy the nodes that I need. So I need the local boolean. I'm also going to need the assign and the assign at the bottom. So we're going to change the value of the boolean based on those two nodes. And then I'm going to also copy the comparison. So I'm going to copy the nut and the end that I have right here. Here we go. Copy all those 5 nodes. Then I can go back in my while loop with break and I can paste them right here. Here we go. And now I can just reconnect everything together. So at the beginning of my while loop, I'm going to set my value to false because I don't want to break. I want it to be false by default. Then I'm going to go into my branch. In the branch, I'm still going to continue comparing the condition of my while loop, but I'm also going to compare it with the nut of my boolean. So if my boolean wants to break and it's true, it means that, well, even if my condition is equal to true, the while loop is still going to break because not all booleans are true. So here we go. So I'm just going to reorganize things a little bit right here. Here we go, just like that. So at the beginning of the function, we set the do we want to break boolean to false, and then we're going to compare with the status of that boolean. If that one is set to true or that the initial condition is false, it's going to complete the while loop. But right now it's not possible to set it to false because this little assign is never connected. So I'm just going to connect it back to my inputs. It creates myself a new little pin right here that I can then rename break because that's the name of the pin. It's going to break the while loop. Here we go. Now we're done for real with the while loop with break and delay. Good, we're done with the 3 functions we needed today. We now have a for loop with break and delay, a for each loop with break and delay, and also a while loop with break and delay, and it's now time to go test them. So to test them right now, since we created a blueprint macro library as a child of actor that you can see right here in the class setting. So if you check in the class setting, you can see that the parent class is equal to actor. It means that these macro can only be used inside actors or child of actors. So if we want to test them, we have to create ourselves an actor to call those functions. So I'm going to right click right here, create a new blueprint class, and it has to be an actor. A pawn can also work, character, a game mode can also work because they are all child of actors, but I'm just going to take a default actor for now. So new blueprint right here, the name doesn't really matter, I just want to make sure that I have access to my function. So I'm going to go in my event graph, and then I'm going to search for with break and delay, and we can see that we now have the for loop with break and delay, for each loop with break and delay, while loop with break and delay, and then I can call them obviously, and it's going to work as normal for each loop and while loop. So we can test them and it should work properly. But there's just one other thing that I wanted to do today, and it is to make sure that those functions are also callable inside the user interface. And right now they are not. If I try to go create myself a user interface, so right here, user interface widget, the blueprint, and then I can select the parent class, doesn't matter. I'm just going to take the user widget, which is the default one, and then I can go in the graph of that widget. So in the widget, in the graph, now I can try to find the with, break, and delay functions, and they are not available because the parent class of the widget blueprint is obviously the widget, and that's not an actor, it's a widget. If we want to have access to those functions inside the widget, we have to recreate them inside the macro library that is a child of widget. Yeah, that's a bit annoying, and that's probably why Epic didn't integrate those functions inside the engine. Oh, that, or maybe just because it's not really recommended. Anyway, we're gonna create them ourselves because we want to have access to those functions inside the widget. So we're gonna do the same exact thing, but inside the macro library that is a child of widget this time. So let's go back in the content browser. I'm gonna create myself a new macro library. So right click, blueprint macro library. This time I'm going to select the class of my widget. So I'm gonna search for user widget, which is the parent class of all the widgets in the engine. So user widget, select right here. I'm going to name it, let's say BML underscore delay underscore widget, because it's a child of the widget class. And now we can open that macro library. We can see that it looks exactly the same as the previous one, but if you go in the class settings right here at the top, you can see that on the right, the parent class is user widget. So these macros should be usable inside a user widget, and we can test it right away. We have a new macro right here. So that's the name of our macro, new macro. And if I go back in my new user widget right here, I can search for new macro, and we can see that the macro is right here. Hey, we can use that new macro. So now we just have to, well, delete that because we don't need that one, and recreate the same macros that we did inside the previous function library. So the BML delay actor, we're going to recreate them the exact same thing inside the BML delay widget, so we can use them inside the widget also. I'm going to do that real quick. If you want to do it on your side too, you can just go back in the video and rewatch the first part because it's going to be the exact same thing. But I'm going to speed this up a little bit, so I'm going to see you in a second. There we go. So now all my functions are created. So I have my while loop with delay right here, for loop with delay, actually for each loop with delay, and finally my for loop with delay. I go quickly because they are the same as the ones we already did, but these ones are going to be callable inside the widget blueprint. Oh, actually, I just noticed that I have a problem right here. I inverted my break and my execute. There we go. Just like that. I fixed my for loop with break and delay. Yeah, just be really careful that you're reconnecting the pins to the right locations. Otherwise, it's not going to work, obviously. Good. Okay, so these are my functions. Now I can go back in my new widget, the blueprint, and now I should be able to search for with the break and delay. And hey, I have access to my for loop with break and delay, for each and while loop with break and delay, and we can call them obviously. So with break and delay, here we go, and we can call them, test them, and see if they work. And actually today, to show you that they work, I already set up a little user interface to be able to easily test those functions. So I'm gonna go back in my project, in my example 2, I have my loop loops with delay user interface right here. So I can open that one. And if we look at this, we can see that it's not that complicated. Actually, I'm gonna zoom in a little bit. There we go. So in my loops with delay user interface, I have 3 columns, one for my for loop, for each loop, and while loop. And all those loops are going to work the same way. So I have a little text right here that is going to display the current value of the for loop. So in the for loop is going to display the current index of the for loop. For the for each loop, it's going to display the current element of the for each loop. And for the while loop, it's going to display another value. Because there's not really a value associated with the while loop, then for all those loops, we have a start and a break button to be able to start and break out of the for each and start and break out of the while loop. And same thing, we also have a delay for all of those. So that's the slider that's going to let me adjust the delay in between iterations of my loops. For the for loop, we have 2 other spin boxes, one for the start index and the last index. So these are going to be the indexes of my for loop. Then for the for each loop, we have an init text that lets us write the elements that we're going to loop through inside the array. So here I have a few fruits. I have apple, banana, pear, grape, cherry, oranges, and then I can loop through all of those during my for each loop. And finally, for the while loop, it's just a simple checkbox because that's the condition of a while loop. It's just a checkbox to see if the condition is still valid or not, and that's going to be decided using this little checkbox right here. So that was for the user interface. Now let's take a look at the graph. So in the graph right here, I have a bunch of code, but it's pretty straightforward. So here at the top, I have my for loop. So when I click on start for loop, it's going to start my for loop with break and delay. For the first index and last index, they are going to come from my user interface. These are the spin blocks that we just saw 2 seconds ago. And then same thing for the delay. I have my delay right here that is provided to my for loop. And finally, when I click on break, it's going to obviously break out of the for loop. And during the for loop, I'm just going to update the text that is written on screen. So my little text is going to represent the index of my for loop. And then I'm also going to write looping and completed, depending if the for loop is looping or if it's completed. That way we're going to see if, well, the for loop is looping or if it's completed, because there's a delay, so it's hard to know if it's still looping or if it's completed. That's just going to help us see that, well, the for loop is still looping or actually completed. Then we have the same thing for the for each and the while loop. So here, this is my for each loop. When I click on start, it's going to start my for each loop with break and delay. For the array, I'm going to use my text box that I have in my user interface and split it at every end of line. So here I have an end of line character that's going to create an array based on all my fruits that I've written in the user interface, and the delay is coming from my spin box. And when I click on break, it's going to break. For the loop body, I'm doing pretty much the same thing. So I'm updating my text in my user interface, writing both the array element and the array index. That way we can see everything that's happening with the for loop. And then I'm also going to write looping and completed, depending if the for each loop is looping or completed. And lastly, we have the while loop. So here, same thing. I have my while loop with break and delay. When I click on start, it's going to start it. The condition comes from the checkbox in the user interface. I have my delay. And when I click on break, it's going to break. During the loop body, this time I'm going to do a flip-flop because there's not really something that gets updated during the while loop. So I'm going to do a flip-flop so we can see a difference in the user interface every iteration. And finally, I'm also going to write the looping and completed, depending if the loop is looping or completed. Okay, that was for the blueprint. There's a bunch of stuff in there, and now we're just going to test to see if it works. So I'm going to run my id_utility widget that I have right here. Here we go. I have my 3 columns, and I'm also going to select it right here at the top. So select my user interface. That way, when I click on start, we're also going to see the flow in the graph that's running every iteration of the for loop. So here we can see that it's running. We can see the number goes up, doop, and we can also break out of the for loop before the ends. We can increase the time between iteration of the for loop. So now we can see that it runs every 1.5 seconds. So it runs way slower. So we can see that it goes up, but super slowly. We can reduce that time also, so we can make it super fast. It goes all the way to 10, super fast. There we go. So it seems to work. I can break anyway, even if the delay is short or long, doesn't really matter. And then I can try to change the first and last index. So let's say between 8 and 16. If I start my loop now, it's going to start at 8 and end at 16. It was a little bit fast. So 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, spacing 16. There we go. It finished my loop. So now I can start at 8 and break at any time. There we go. The for loop seems to work. Now it's time to take a look at the for each. So I'm going to scroll down a little bit right here. If I click on start, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to loop through all the fruits that are written in my user interface right here. So start to it goes through all of them. I can increase the time because it's really fast. So banana, pear, grape, cherry, orange, so it seemed to work. I can break at any time, so let's say I break at pear, there we go, I broke at pear. I can remove a few fruits, so I'm gonna just keep those three. Apple, banana, orange, there we go, it seems to work, apple, banana, orange. I can add some other things in there, so I can add the random elements, start, apple, and then banana, orange, there we go. It seems to work, so start, break at any point, and the for each loop works as expected. Perfect. The last one is the while loop, so I'm gonna scroll down here and it's the same thing. I can start my while loop, and that one is a while loop, so it's never going to complete until I uncheck that condition right here. So we can see that it goes true, false, true, false, true, false, true, false. We can increase the time between the true falses, so true, false, true, false. There we go, it's way slower. I can reduce the time so it goes super fast, and I can stop it at any point. So uncheck that condition, there we go, the while loop is completed. If I try to start a new while loop while that condition is false, obviously it's just going to fail because we're not going to start a while loop while the condition is false. The condition has to be true to start a new while loop. So I can start a new while loop by checking the condition and clicking on start. There we go, now the while loop is running, and same thing, I can break out of the while loop even if my condition is still checked, because that's what I wanted. I wanted to be able to break out of the while loop without having to change that condition. Here we go. So I guess that's it. That covered all the little functions we had to look into today. So now you know how to create a for each, and while loop with delays in Blueprint. And that's going to be it for today's video. So I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye bye.